5 objections stood between Moses and the road back to Egypt. By the time he faced Pharaoh, Moses was 80 years old. But before that moment, God answered 5 objections and placed 3 signs in his hands. The 5th objection exposed something every mature believer must recognize: the line between humble caution and quiet refusal. How can a believer tell when caution has become resistance, especially when God is already supplying what obedience requires? That is the question behind these 5 signs. The final sign carries the decisive test, anchored in the exact moment when Moses ran out of reasons and still asked God to choose somebody else. In Galax, Virginia, 76-year-old Marion Keene sat alone in the empty choir loft after Sunday evening service. The Lord had laid the visitation ministry on her heart. She wrote her name on the volunteer card, stared at it, then drew one line through it. She did not feel rebellious. She felt realistic. That difference matters. Some refusals sound angry. Others sound humble, responsible, even spiritual. Moses did not shake his fist at heaven. He asked reasonable questions. He named real limitations. Yet God kept answering him. The story begins at a burning bush. Beyond the fire stands a deeper mystery. How can a man stand before holy ground, hear the voice of God, receive an answer to every fear, and still say no? The first sign is quiet. The second is more personal. By the 5th, there is nowhere left to hide. The first sign is the easiest to dismiss. A need larger than personal comfort enters the believer's field of responsibility. Moses had built a life in Midian. Egypt was behind him. Pharaoh was behind him. The buried body, the flight through the desert, and the identity he once carried in the palace all belonged to another chapter. He had a family. He had work. He knew the land. Then a bush burned without being consumed. God began by naming the suffering of other people, not by promising Moses a better life. Israel was in bondage. Their cry had reached heaven, and the man who had once tried to help through impulsive violence was now being called to return through obedient dependence. The Lord said, "Come now, therefore, and I will send thee unto Pharaoh, that thou mayest bring forth my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt." Notice the direction of the call. It moved Moses towards service, not self-importance. The something big took the form of freedom for people who could not free themselves. That gives the first test. Does the stirring lead toward biblical responsibility, costly love, truth, reconciliation, or service? Or does it only create fantasies of recognition? A divine assignment can be large, without making the person look large. It may mean making the phone call pride has delayed. It may mean teaching a child the scriptures after believing that season has passed. It may mean serving where nobody applauds. It may mean telling the truth in a room where convenience would be easier. Obedience measures the size of a calling more faithfully than visibility. This is where the reference point must remain firm. A hard season by itself proves nothing. Pressure is not automatic promotion. Loss is not automatic pruning. Restlessness is not automatic direction. Scripture gives a clearer pattern. God names what faithfulness requires, and the requirement agrees with his character. Instead of a vague feeling called destiny, Moses received a responsibility. But responsibility immediately exposed the second sign. The second sign is more uncomfortable. The assignment reveals an insufficiency that can no longer be hidden. Moses heard the words, "I will send thee," and his first response was not confidence. It was a question. And Moses said unto God, "Who am I, that I should go unto Pharaoh, and that I should bring forth the children of Israel out of Egypt?" That question was not foolish. Moses knew Pharaoh's power. He knew his own history. He knew that Israel had rejected his earlier attempt to intervene. "Who am I?" was the honest sound of human scale colliding with divine assignment. God's answer rested on divine presence, not on a list of Moses' strengths. Moses was never told that he was secretly brilliant, naturally persuasive, or destined to impress the court. And he said, "Certainly I will be with thee, and this shall be a token unto thee, that I have sent thee. When thou hast brought forth the people out of Egypt, ye shall serve God upon this mountain." The answer to "Who am I?" was, "I will be with thee." That changes the test. Preparation does not always feel like growing self-confidence. Sometimes, it feels like losing confidence in every foundation that cannot carry the assignment. One kind of humility receives grace. Another uses weakness as a locked door. The first says, "This is beyond me, so I must depend on God." The second says, "This is beyond me, so God could never ask it." Only one of those is humility. Perhaps this is where the struggle becomes personal. A believer can be walking with the Lord for 50 years and still confuse a trembling voice with a forbidden path. The test is not whether fear is present. The test is whether God's promised presence is allowed to matter more than fear. Moses asked what he should say when Israel demanded the name of the God who sent him. God answered. Moses said they would not believe him. God answered again. Each answer removed one layer of uncertainty. Then God asked a question of his own. The third sign is harder to notice because it often looks ordinary. God draws attention to something already within reach. And the Lord said unto him, "What is that in thine hand?" And he said, "A rod." It was shepherd's wood. It carried no title. It had no jeweled handle. It had not come from Pharaoh's armory. Moses had probably leaned on it through heat, dust, and long miles behind sheep. It belonged to the life he may have considered smaller than the life he lost in Egypt. God told him to cast it on the ground. The rod became a serpent, and Moses fled from it. Then God told him to take it by the tail. The same hand that released the rod had to reach toward what frightened him. When Moses obeyed, it became a rod again. Surrender, rather than rarity, gave the object its importance. That is the third test, is the believer asking for an extraordinary resource while dismissing what God has already placed nearby. For one person, it may be time. For another, a room, a phone, a hard-earned lesson, or access to somebody who trusts her. It may be a quiet ability to listen. It may be the testimony she rarely tells because it does not sound dramatic enough. God's question was not, "What do you wish were in your hand?" It was, "What is that in thine hand?" This sign protects the video from a dangerous fantasy. Biblical preparation begins with reality and obedience, far from the idea that every ordinary object will become miraculous. Faith takes inventory before it demands novelty. The Lord then gave Moses further signs. His hand became leprous and was restored. Water from the river would become blood upon dry land. God supplied the credibility the assignment required instead of asking Moses to manufacture it. Then came the sentence that connected the instrument to the road ahead. "And thou shalt take this rod in thine hand, wherewith thou shalt do signs." The rod would later stretch over waters. It would appear before power. It would remain visible, while frightened people learned that deliverance did not depend on Moses looking impressive. But the rod could not walk to Egypt by itself. Provision still required a response. One more detail sharpens that scene. God did not tell Moses to admire the sign from a safe distance. When the rod became a serpent, Moses ran. Then the Lord told him to reach down and take it by the tail. The object in his hand became frightening, before it became useful again. Preparation sometimes brings a believer closer to the very weakness that once sent her running. The old failure must be faced. The neglected ability must be picked up. The conversation must be entered with clean motives. The ordinary gift must be placed under God's direction. The recognized sign was a command precise enough to obey with trembling hands, not a sudden rush of bravery. That is firmer ground than excitement. Excitement rises and falls. A faithful next step can still be taken when the hands tremble. This is a good place to examine what is already in reach. The Watchman's Guide in the first pinned comment was prepared to help continue that examination with scripture and prayer. It is there as a gift for the person ready to stop overlooking the next faithful step. The fourth sign is more exposing. God provides help, but the help does not replace the obedience. Moses moved from credibility to speech. And Moses said unto the Lord, "O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither heretofore, nor since thou hast spoken unto thy servant. But I am slow of speech, and of a slow tongue." This limitation sounded final. Moses was not describing a passing emotion. He was naming the very ability the assignment seemed to demand. God answered, "And the Lord said unto him, Who hath made man's mouth? Or who maketh the dumb, or deaf, or the seeing, or the blind? Have not I the Lord? Then the command came with a promise. Now therefore go, and I will be with thy mouth, and teach thee what thou shalt say. God did not deny that Moses felt slow of speech. He placed the limitation beneath a greater fact. The maker of the mouth was not absent from the assignment, and God provided Aaron. Aaron could speak well. He would meet Moses. He would be glad in his heart. God would teach them what to do. This was help through another person, help already moving toward Moses while Moses was still arguing at the bush. Aaron's role was to stand beside Moses, never replace him. Taking it to the Lord in prayer does not make sound counsel unnecessary. Sometimes the answer to prayer arrives with a name and a chair beside the burden. That distinction matters in every church, family, and calling. Sometimes a believer prays for confirmation, then rejects the person who brings it, because the help does not erase the difficult part. Sometimes she asks the Lord to open a way, then expects the open way to require no courage. The fourth test is simple. When sound counsel, partnership, training, or confirmation arrives, does it move the person toward obedience? Or does resistance invent a new condition? Peter later faced this same collision in a different form. On a housetop, he saw the vision repeated 3 times. A voice told him to rise, kill, and eat. Peter answered, but Peter said, "Not so, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean." The reply came, and the voice spake unto him again the second time, "What God hath cleansed, that call not thou common." While Peter considered the vision, 3 men sent by Cornelius stood at the gate. God was working on both sides of Peter's hesitation. The correction, the messengers, and the assignment converged. Peter still had to walk down the stairs and stand before the men at the gate. Calling God Lord sharpens the contradiction when the next word is no, and that leads to the most dangerous sign. The 5th sign is the one that exposes resistance. Every objection receives an answer, but the request remains, send somebody else. Before returning to Moses, Naaman provides a sharp mirror. Naaman wanted healing. He arrived at Elisha's door with horses, a chariot, status, and an expectation. He imagined the prophet coming outside, calling on the name of the Lord, moving his hand over the diseased place, and producing a recovery that felt worthy of a commander. Elisha sent a messenger with a simple instruction: wash in Jordan 7 times. Naaman became angry. He turned away from the answer because it did not resemble the answer he had rehearsed. Scripture records, "And his servants came near, and spake unto him, and said, My father, if the prophet had bid thee do some great thing, wouldest thou not have done it? How much rather then, when he saith to thee, Wash, and be clean?" The irony cuts deep. Naaman was willing to do some great thing. He nearly refused the small act through which the great gift would come. Expectation can become a form of resistance when it dictates the only shape obedience is allowed to take. Now the story returns to the bush. Moses had asked who he was. God promised his presence. Moses asked what he should say. God revealed his name. Moses said Israel would not believe. God supplied signs. Moses said he could not speak. God promised to teach his mouth and provided Aaron. The reasons had been answered. Then Moses said, and he said, O my Lord, send I pray thee, by the hand of him whom thou wilt send. The wording sounds polite. It is wrapped in reverence. But its meaning is plain. Please send someone else. The next verse does not describe another patient reassurance. It says, And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. And he said, Is not Aaron the Levite thy brother? I know that he can speak well. And also, behold, he cometh forth to meet thee, and when he seeth thee, he will be glad in his heart. Why did the tone change? Because the issue had changed. Earlier questions sought what obedience required. The final request sought release from obedience itself. That is the decisive test promised at the beginning. After God answers the central fear, supplies the next step, and provides appropriate help, does the objection become more specific and honest, or does it merely change shape so that obedience can remain postponed? Wise caution examines the path. Resistance keeps moving the finish line. Wise caution receives truth, counsel, and correction. Resistance treats every answer as material for a new excuse. Wise caution may tremble and still take the next step. Resistance waits for a version of obedience that requires no surrender. The 5 signs now form one pattern. First, a real need enters the field of responsibility. Second, the assignment exposes human insufficiency. Third, God points to something already present. Fourth, help arrives without removing responsibility. Fifth, the excuses continue after the answers. The hidden truth is that God prepared Moses by answering weakness with presence and provision. He gave his word, he gave signs, he repurposed the rod, he promised to teach Moses' mouth, he sent Aaron to meet him. By the time Moses asked for a substitute, the preparation was already surrounding the very places where he felt inadequate. That is why the biblical principle must be named plainly. Obeying when it does not make sense means responding to sufficient light from God in dependence on what God has supplied. The title's "something big" also becomes clearer. It refers to responsibility and participation in God's work, not a guarantee of promotion, wealth, applause, or an easier season. The assignment would cost Moses comfort and expose every weakness. Sometimes the large thing God gives is an entrustment rather than a possession. Pressure alone cannot prove that. A closed door cannot prove it. An attack cannot prove it. Even intense desire cannot prove it. The pattern must be tested by Scripture, God's character, real responsibility, wise counsel, and the next faithful act. Moses did eventually go. And when he stood before Pharaoh, Scripture marked his age. And Moses was 80 years old, and Aaron 83 years old, when they spake unto Pharaoh. At 80, usefulness opened into obedience. The pattern can now become a practical examination. Question 1. Is the burden moving toward service and faithfulness, or merely toward recognition? Question 2. Is inadequacy producing dependence on God, or being used as permanent permission to withdraw? Question 3. What ordinary resource is already in the believer's hand? Question 4. Has trustworthy help arrived that supports obedience without replacing it? Question 5. After the main fear was answered, did the reason for delay simply change? These questions demand honesty rather than impulse. If the path involves danger, abuse, medical need, financial risk, or a decision beyond personal competence, seek qualified help and wise pastoral counsel. Obedience never requires pretending that wisdom is unbelief. But when Scripture is clear, the responsibility is real, and the next faithful step has been supplied. Fear no longer deserves the final word. The burning bush made God's nearness visible without enlarging Moses. The rod carried his history forward instead of erasing it. Aaron brought help that met the assignment rather than removed it. And the final refusal did not end the story. By God's grace, Moses still took the staff. He still returned to Egypt. He still stood where fear once told him he could never stand. So the last image is not a crown descending on a person waiting for promotion. It is an old shepherd's hand closing around ordinary wood because the Lord had said, "Now therefore go." The hand that once rose to refuse can still close around the staff God has already placed in that waiting hand.